Hey everyone, let's talk a little bit about the genre of travel writing. Now, this is material that you're going to use for the Module 2 essay as well. So it's a little more comprehensive than what you actually need for the week 3 activity. You'll be doing something different with that. So travel writing has always been a part of the literary world. Even in ancient Greece and Rome, they were writing narratives of places they've traveled. Marco Polo wrote about his travels to China. There have been just always been a fascination for recording what one has encountered in their travels and for people to read about those encounters. The problem with a lot of those early narratives, though, they were more fiction than fact. There were outrageous stories about the peoples that were encountered and the unusual things that people did in these different cultures. So they couldn't really be relied upon. What we start seeing in the 18th century is that travel narratives become increasingly popular, and they're kind of reflecting the public's growing appreciation and desire to know more about the world than they could get from reading earlier accounts that, as we just said, were more fiction than fact. So one of the things that you're going to be using for your for the larger assignment for this module is this slide on the conventions of travel narrative, and I will do a separate video on this and put it in the that essay folder, the Module 1 essay folder. All right, but there are some common conventions that you can see that you've encountered some of these already in the Rowlandson and the Cabeza de Vaca, and you'll see some of them to a lesser extent in the night piece that you're reading. So we'll come back to this slide in a subsequent video. This one as well we'll return to. There are lots of issues that we can talk about. So if we want to talk about travel narratives, we can talk about a lot of different things. We can talk about the motivation. Why did people write them? And most of this lecture that we're looking at here, material, is geared more towards the female, because we were doing Sarah Kemble Knight in this module. So a lot of this talks more about gender issues, but we have some general issues as well. So in general, why did people travel? Different reasons. Their social backgrounds make a difference as to what they say about the cultures that they go through, how they see things through their own social perspective. Again, things about gender, what the expectations of them are as writers, and what their expectations of the people of different genders around them are, and how those things change depending on where they're traveling. And looking at culture from their own perspective. So we learn about their own culture, and we learn about the culture that they're writing about. So those are just a few of the issues. I talk about a couple of the more famous travel narratives. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's husband was an ambassador, so she traveled with him to Turkey, and her accounts were very well received because people were really interested in what they called the strange customs of foreigners, right? And if you were to take American Lit 2, we'd see how immigrants to America brought their foreign ways with them, in how those ways were not always appreciated by the people into whose neighborhoods they moved. But that's a different course. We won't see much of that in this first American Lit 1. We'll be reading Equiano's The Interesting Narrative. He was a slave. He was brought to Europe as a slave. But the writing that we're reading is not really a traditional slave narrative. We'll be reading some of those later in the semester. We're looking at his work as a travel narrative, because that's really what he did. He traveled around. Very interesting character. So now we can bring race into the mix, as well as interesting issues that we can talk about. And we already mentioned a couple of these. Gender issues that we could talk about, sexuality, race, professionalism, all kinds of things we could talk about. offering larger pictures of imperialism, colonialism, right? And what works and what does not work in women's texts or in men's texts as well. Um, so let's see what else we have, Jim. So Sarah Kemble Knight's work was not like some travel narratives were written specifically to be published, like the Cabeza de Vaca. He was writing that to be published, to be circulated broadly. Knight's journal was not really written for others' eyes. She was just writing for herself. Perhaps there would have been more editing if she were writing with publication in mind, because it's pretty clear that there was no self-editing going on. So journals would have been written for one's own self or family or friends, but not necessarily for wider publication, particularly for a female writer. So those are some things that you can think about just in general that we're going to be looking at more broadly as we go throughout this module, and we'll be returning to again, particularly in the final activity for the module.